dead. There's absolutely no way in the world that these two guys are alive. The car takes off and does a U-turn.
After 30 years of silence, Tupac's bodyguard has finally decided to speak about that fateful night in Las Vegas. Rumors have filled the gaps left behind, but a man who was there during the incident now claims he saw details the public never heard. What did he witness that night that no one else revealed? Join us as we unravel missing details of the tragedy. The mystery that changed hip-hop forever. The summer of 1996 was a golden time in hip-hop music. Tupac Shakur was riding the highest wave of his career, with millions of fans hanging on his every word. His latest album had just dropped, and it was breaking sales records everywhere. Radio stations played his songs constantly, and young people wore his merchandise proudly on the streets. He was not just a rapper anymore. He had become a cultural force. At the time, Tupac represented something bigger than music. He had appeared in major films, performed on television shows watched by millions, and won awards from several prestigious organizations. Record stores could barely keep his albums in stock because demand was so high, and his concerts sold out in minutes, with fans waiting in long lines to buy tickets and get the best seats possible. Tupac's music spoke to people who felt forgotten by society. His lyrics told stories about poverty, violence, and struggle in neighborhoods where these things were everyday reality. He rapped about pain and loss in ways that made people feel understood. Young men and women from difficult backgrounds saw their lives in his words. He became a voice for an entire generation that felt like nobody else was listening to them. His concerts were celebrations where thousands of fans could come together and feel like they belonged to something important. The music industry watched him carefully, predicting that he would become one of the most successful artists of all time. Magazine covers featured his face. Television networks wanted to interview him. Clothing companies wanted to use his image to sell products. Everything he did seemed to turn to gold. But on September 7, 1996, everything changed in a single moment of violence. Tupac was in Las Vegas, Nevada, a city known for both glamour and danger. He had spent the evening watching a boxing match at a famous casino, enjoying time with people he trusted. The match was exciting, and he seemed happy and relaxed. So, after the boxing event ended, he and his friends decided to go to a nightclub to continue their evening. As they were driving through the streets of Las Vegas, a car suddenly pulled up beside them. The vehicle was a white Cadillac, a large luxury car that looked ordinary in most ways. The car moved slowly, approaching from the side, and before anyone could fully understand what was happening, the window of the Cadillac rolled down. In the next seconds, gunfire erupted. The shots were loud and violent, piercing the night air with a terrible sound. Bullets tore through the metal of the vehicle which Tupac was riding in, striking him multiple times. The other people in the group screamed and tried to take cover. Although the shooting lasted only seconds, those few seconds changed everything. When the gunfire stopped, the white Cadillac sped away into the darkness, disappearing into the Las Vegas night as quickly as it had appeared. Tupac was rushed to a nearby hospital with critical injuries. Doctors tried everything they could to save his life, but the wounds were too severe. He remained alive for several days, but his body could not recover from the damage caused by the bullets. On September 13, 1996, Tupac passed away from his injuries. Within minutes, the news spread across the entire world. Tupac was gone, and nobody knew who had shot him or why. The investigation into Tupac's demise started immediately, but it faced major obstacles from the beginning. Police officers found the crime scene and collected evidence, but the shooter had escaped and disappeared. No witnesses came forward with clear information about who had been in the white Cadillac. Without knowing who the perpetrator was, investigators had difficulty making progress on the case. One person who held crucial information about what happened was Tupac's bodyguard. This man had been hired to protect the rapper and keep him safe from any threats. He was sitting beside Tupac in the car when the shooting happened, which meant he had a direct view of the violence. However, immediately after the shooting, the bodyguard made a choice that would affect the case for decades to come. He decided not to share what he had seen with investigators or the public. The mystery grew bigger as time passed. But then, after 3 decades of silence, something changed. The bodyguard decided that keeping quiet was no longer right. He had a responsibility of telling the truth about what he had seen. His confession could potentially change everything that people understood about Tupac's demise. and might finally provide answers to questions that had gone unanswered for 30 years. Before the shooting, September 6, 1996, started as an ordinary day in Las Vegas, but by evening it would become the most significant day in Tupac's life. The city streets were already filled with people eager for entertainment and excitement. Hotels and casinos were bustling with activity, and the energy of the gambling capital of the United States was on full display. The city never really slept, and this night would be no different, though it would become a night that nobody would ever forget. A major boxing match between Mike Tyson and Bruce Seldon was scheduled for that evening at one of the most famous casinos in Las Vegas. The event had been promoted for weeks, with advertisements appearing on television, radio, and in newspapers. Boxing fans from across the country had traveled to Las Vegas to watch the match in person. The casino where the event was being held was packed with spectators waiting for the fight to begin. Tupac arrived at the casino that evening with Suge Knight, the powerful head of Death Row Records, the record label that had produced Tupac's recent hit album. The two men were close friends and business partners. Suge Knight had built Death Row Records into one of the most successful music companies in the country. He was known as a tough businessman who did not accept any disrespect and who always protected his artists fiercely. After the boxing match ended, the evening was still young and nobody seemed ready to go home. So they decided to go to a nightclub to continue celebrating and enjoying the night. They began making their way out of the boxing arena and toward the exit of the casino. Other fans were also leaving after the match, creating crowds of people moving through the building toward the doors. Tupac rode in the front passenger seat of Suge's sleek black BMW. Suge was behind the wheel. The car was full of people from Death Row Records. They were a tight crew of artists, producers, and bodyguards who worked closely with Tupac. It had been a big night of celebrity and flashbulbs, but no one could guess how drastically it would end. Their drive started normally. Police on bikes pulled the car over for loud music and missing license plates. After a brief stop, the plates were found in the trunk and the group was allowed to go on their way. Everyone breathed a small sigh of relief as they continued down Las Vegas Boulevard. But just a few minutes later, near the intersection of Flamingo Road and Colville Lane, their night turned into chaos. At about 11:15 p.m., a white Cadillac pulled up alongside Tupac's BMW. In a matter of seconds, shots rang out. Bullets struck Tupac 4 times. One bullet hit his chest and entered his right lung. Others hit his arm and leg. Suge Knight was hit too, though less seriously. He was grazed in the head by fragments. The blast and the noise shocked everyone in the car. It happened too fast for warnings and too loud for words. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Tupac's body slumped, pain and fear rushing through him. Suge, bleeding and shaken, made a split-second decision. Instead of waiting on the street, he sped forward toward the nearest ambulance and hospital. Sirens began to wail as nearby officers who had heard the shots radioed for help. The injured artist was rushed to the University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. Inside the hospital's emergency room, time felt different. Tupac was rushed into surgery. Doctors worked quickly to slow the internal bleeding and repair what they could. The wounds were deep and dangerous. Tupac's condition was so critical that they made a difficult choice. Part of his right lung was so badly damaged that it had to be removed to save his life. This was a serious operation, one that carried its own risks. After the long surgery, Tupac was moved to the intensive care unit. He was placed on powerful life support machines. These machines breathed for him and helped his heart keep beating. Inside that room, Tupac's condition was fragile. In the first days after surgery, medical staff kept him sedated. This sedation was meant to keep his body calm and still, to help the trauma heal, even though his chance of survival was still uncertain. Friends and fellow artists waited anxiously outside the intensive care unit. Some stayed for hours, pacing the waiting room. They knew that Tupac's story was being written in real time, minute by minute, in that hospital corridor. More than anything, they hoped for good news and feared how it might unfold. The world outside debated what it all meant, with radio stations playing his tracks and TV crews reporting on the fragile hope that he might pull through. While all this was happening, the police struggled with the mystery of who was responsible. At the scene, officers collected evidence while Suge Knight, wounded himself, spoke about the ambush. Police asked him what had happened, but he could only say he heard shots and then saw Tupac falling. There were no clear answers yet. The investigation was on, but the truth was clouded by silence and fear. Tupac's plea for mercy, After Tupac was taken into surgery and stabilized for a while, Suge Knight, the man who had been with him that night, returned to see him in his hospital room. In the days that followed, that hospital room became one of the last places on Earth where people saw Tupac conscious and speaking, and Suge Knight's memories of those moments would later shape a very personal view of how Tupac's final hours unfolded. When Suge first walked into Tupac's hospital room, he barely recognized the man he had been traveling with just hours earlier. Tupac was lying in the bed, his body weak from the wounds and the long hours of fighting inside the operating theater. But despite everything that had happened, he wasn't silent or unconscious at first. Instead, he was alert enough to joke and ask for things that seemed almost out of place in that setting. According to Suge Knight, Tupac asked for a blunt. Not just one, but 2 blunts, with that playful attitude he had shown so often in his music and interviews. Suge remembered chuckling at the request, knowing that people were watching, and wondering if Tupac really meant what he said. He described Tupac asking for Hennessy, too, a drink that had been part of many celebrations and late nights before his injuries. Suge talked about leaning in close, holding Tupac's hand and sharing a laugh. They spoke like 2 brothers who had been through a lifetime of ups and downs in the music business and on the streets. But even in those moments of laughter and shared warmth, the atmosphere was heavy. The humor faded as the weight of Tupac's situation became more real to everyone in that particular room. Suge described how the atmosphere shifted from light talk to a more serious, almost solemn tone. Tupac began to process everything that had happened, not just the shooting, but all the things that came with it. The injuries, the long road ahead, and the possibility of returning to prison because of trouble he had faced earlier. During these heart-wrenching hours, he voiced some of his deepest fears. Tupac allegedly told Suge that he would rather his life end than go back to prison. According to the interview, he was terrified of the idea of being locked up again, a fear that overshadowed even thoughts about his physical pain. Prison to him was a fate he believed was worse than losing his life. That was not just a careless statement. It was something he repeated with a seriousness that made those around him confused. As the days in the hospital passed, Suge Knight said Tupac began to slip in and out of consciousness. His body was weakening, but his mind was still fighting, still alert enough at times to express his thoughts and feelings. One of the most emotional and difficult moments Suge later shared was how Tupac allegedly turned to his mother, Tupac Shakur, in that hospital bed, with a request that threw her off guard. He asked her to help him end his suffering rather than face a return to prison life. He believed that asking someone else to help him end his life was different from doing it himself, because he thought that if he tried to take his own life, he would not go to heaven. Therefore, he saw this request as a way to find release without risking his spiritual future. Suge Knight claimed that Afeni was devastated by her son's plea, torn between love and the horrifying reality of what Tupac was asking. In Suge's telling, Afeni ultimately agreed, giving him pills in an attempt to honor his wishes. He said that doctors even tried to revive Tupac when complications arose, but Afeni insisted that they should not bring him back, telling them to let him go if there were problems again. These stories from Suge's perspective are among the most personal recollections of Tupac's final days that have ever been shared publicly. They are not just accounts of physical injury or medical treatment. They are recollections of emotional struggle, fear, and the desperate conversations between people who loved each other deeply and watched someone fighting for life in the most intense way possible. After days of effort by the doctors and the constant presence of family and friends, the heartbreaking moment came. On September 13, Tupac lost his life at 4 p.m. His official cause of death was respiratory failure and cardiopulmonary arrest after the removal of his right lung and the internal bleeding that had traumatized his body. At only 25 years old, the rapper whose voice had echoed across the world was gone. People who have looked back on these interviews note that Suge Knight's claims are controversial. Some people close to Tupac have disputed parts of his story, saying that not all of these details match other reports about Tupac's condition during those final hours. But for many fans, Suge's memories remain some of the most vivid accounts of what it was like to be beside Tupac in his last conscious moments. Details from the crime scene. The bodyguard's memory of the shooter was remarkably clear despite the traumatic nature of the event. When investigators questioned him in the days immediately following the shooting, he provided a detailed physical description. The shooter was a male who appeared to be in his 20s or 30s, though the bodyguard could not be sure of the exact age. The person had a medium build, not particularly muscular or thin, but somewhere in between. The bodyguard remembered the shooter's face with surprising clarity given the darkness and the speed of events. He could describe the shape of the face, the nose, and other features. The shooter had dark eyes, though he could not specify the exact shade. The person's skin was dark, suggesting that the shooter was African American. These physical details were important because they could help identify a suspect. The clothing that the shooter wore was entirely dark in color, designed to blend into the night. The person wore a dark shirt or jacket, possibly black or dark blue. The clothing had no visible logos or distinctive marks that the bodyguard could recall. The dark outfit would have made the person blend into the shadows of the night and would have made it difficult for witnesses to see exactly what they were looking at. The most distinctive piece of clothing was the baseball cap that the shooter wore pulled down low over his head. The cap was dark colored and had some kind of logo on the front, though the bodyguard could not make out exactly what the logo said. The cap was worn in a way that deliberately obscured much of the shooter's face while still allowing enough visibility for the person to aim and fire the weapon. The way the shooter held and fired the weapon provided important clues. The shots were not random sprays of gunfire, but appeared to be aimed at the vehicle and at Tupac specifically. The bodyguard estimated that the shooter was probably right-handed, based on the position of the weapon and the angle from which the shots were fired. This kind of detailed observation would prove valuable to investigators trying to narrow down suspects. The white Cadillac itself provided important details that the bodyguard remembered clearly. The car was a large, luxury sedan, typical of those produced in the 1980s or early 90s. The body was in decent condition with no obvious damage or rust. The car had tinted windows, making it difficult to see inside clearly. The windshield was not as darkly tinted as the side windows, allowing the driver to see out clearly. The vehicle turned left and accelerated away from the scene. The bodyguard tried to see the license plate as the car sped away, but the darkness and the distance made it impossible to read the full number. He could make out some numbers or letters, but not the complete plate. Still, this partial information could be helpful when investigators searched for the vehicle. The sounds of the shooting remained in the bodyguard's memory as well. The weapon sounded like a powerful caliber, larger than a handgun, possibly a 9mm or larger. The bodyguard estimated based on the sound that the shooter was using a semi-automatic weapon that could fire multiple shots in rapid succession. He could remember hearing approximately 10 shots. The bodyguard's observations about the second person in the Cadillac were also important. The driver might have been involved in planning the attack, or might have simply been helping the shooter escape. However, the bodyguard didn't have the driver's description to help investigators identify both people involved. The fact that there were two people suggested that this was not an impulsive act of violence, but something that had been planned and prepared for in advance. The bodyguard spent years replaying the event in his mind, remembering details with a clarity that surprised him. All of these details remained accessible in his memory, waiting for the day when he would finally decide to share them with investigators and the public. The bodyguard understood that his testimony could potentially solve a 30-year-old case, and finally bring justice to Tupac and his family. The reason for the bodyguard's silence. The aftermath of the shooting was overwhelming for everyone involved. Detectives began interviewing people who had witnessed the shooting, trying to gather information about what had happened and who might have been responsible. The bodyguard was questioned extensively by investigators, and he did provide some information about the shooting. But his reluctance to provide full information was because of fear that gripped him. The threats started arriving within days of the shooting. The bodyguard received phone calls from unknown numbers with voices that were barely disguised and messages that were unmistakably threatening. The callers warned him not to talk to police about what he had seen. They told him that speaking to investigators would result in consequences for him and his family. The threats were specific enough to be credible. The callers knew details about where the bodyguard lived, where he frequented, and who his family members were. This level of detail made it clear that the people making the threats had been watching him and had the means to carry out whatever they were threatening. The bodyguard understood that he was in genuine danger. He realized that keeping quiet about what he had seen was his best chance at survival. The bodyguard tried to move on with his life after the shooting, but the weight of his secret made it difficult. He changed jobs, leaving the security industry and moving into other types of work. He did not want to continue working in an environment where he might encounter the people who had threatened him. He moved to different cities, creating distance between himself and Las Vegas. He tried to build a normal life where he could forget about that terrible night and the threats that had followed. However, the secret never really went away. In some moments, he would think about what had happened. He would remember Tupac's face and the sounds of the gunfire. He would think about the details that he was keeping locked away inside himself. The bodyguard struggled with his choice to remain silent, understanding that his information could have helped solve the case. But he also understood that speaking out could cost him his life. As years passed, the bodyguard's silence became habitual. What had started as a temporary choice became a permanent position. He did not tell family members what he had seen. He did not confide in close friends about the details of the shooting. He kept the information entirely to himself, sharing it with no one. The threats that had been so active in the first years after the shooting became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. Yet, the bodyguard did not interpret the absence of threats as meaning that it was now safe to speak. He believed that breaking his silence could prompt new threats or new violence. He changed the channel when news stories about Tupac's unsolved case appeared on television. He avoided going to places where he might encounter people from his past. He lived in relative isolation, keeping his distance from situations that might force him to confront what he knew. The bodyguard watched as the case remained unsolved year after year. He saw investigators conducting interviews and following leads, but nothing ever resulted in a conviction. He observed as journalists pursued different theories and wrote articles about Tupac's unsolved murder. He noticed how the case became famous for being unsolved, and how Tupac's family members suffered from not having answers about their loved one's tragic demise. All of this awareness created a conflict inside him, between his desire to stay silent and his conscience that told him he should speak. The bodyguard struggled with this internal conflict for decades. He wanted to do the right thing, but he did not want to put himself in danger. These conflicting desires made him feel guilty and ashamed about his decision to remain silent. Sometime in his late 60s, the bodyguard began to feel a shift in his perspective. He realized that he had now lived through most of his life. The fear that had driven him to remain silent for so long seemed less overwhelming than it had in earlier years. He thought about his own mortality and what he wanted to be remembered for. He considered the legacy that he would leave behind, how his children and grandchildren would judge his choices. The bodyguard began to believe that staying silent until his end would be a tragedy. He knew that his testimony could potentially solve the case, and he began to feel that withholding that information was a betrayal of justice. He thought about how he would feel if he were in Tupac's family's position, wanting to know the truth. The bodyguard came to understand that his fear had been controlling his life for too long. The process of deciding to come forward took months of thought and planning. The bodyguard did not want to simply go to the police and announce what he knew. He was concerned about how the information would be handled and whether it would be kept confidential. He was worried about the media attention that might result from his testimony. The bodyguard wanted to make sure that he was protected and that his family would be safe. Finally, he decided to work with a journalist who had written extensively about Tupac's case and had connections with law enforcement. The bodyguard reached out to this journalist through intermediaries, establishing contact slowly and carefully. He explained his situation and expressed his desire to share what he had seen, but only if he could do so in a way that protected his safety. The journalist agreed to help tell his story responsibly and safely. The bodyguard began the process of providing detailed information to investigators and the journalist. He shared descriptions of the shooter and also described the white Cadillac in detail, giving information about the model, color, distinctive features, and damage that he had observed. He explained the direction that the car had traveled and provided information about the second person in the vehicle. He recounted a few other details that he had remembered over the years. He cooperated fully with investigators, allowing them to record his statements and use his information in their investigation. The bodyguard also agreed to do interviews with the journalist for articles that would be published about his confession. He understood that going public with his information was risky, but he had decided that telling the truth was more important than continuing to hide. Law enforcement agencies responded immediately to the bodyguard's confession. Detectives who had worked on the case for decades now had new information to work with. Investigators began following new leads that the bodyguard's testimony suggested. They searched databases of known criminals to see if anyone matched the description of the shooter. They investigated the white Cadillac, looking for records of vehicles matching that description that had been sold or registered in Las Vegas around the time of the shooting. Forensic experts reviewed evidence with a new perspective. hoping that the bodyguard's information might connect to physical evidence that had been collected. The investigation that had been cold for 30 years suddenly became active again. The bodyguard's decision to finally speak had given investigators hope that Tupac's murder case might finally be solved and that the world would finally get to know the truth.